Christian bookstore, of course, you will see rows and rows of Bibles. Bibles that have been printed on a printing press in a big factory. All of them are exactly the same. Now, that's not the way it used to be, of course, with scrolls. Every scroll was handwritten. If a scribe had to write a scroll, he had to go from another scroll in order to transcribe that new scroll. So every scroll has a story of its own. There are millions of stories in the world, I'm sure, that have attachments to every scroll there is. And today we're going to share a story from a very special scroll featuring Nehemiah Gordon and Keith Johnson. Welcome to Shabbat Night Live.
Scott, good to be here.
Welcome, Scott. It's great to be here.
Now, we have a scroll in front of us here, but before we describe that one, we have two scrolls that are sisters, if you will, to this one in the ministry that were given to us by the football great Reggie White, the late Reggie White. Awesome. Reggie White, and his wife Sarah still lives in the area, and she has some scrolls of her own, I believe. And he donated these to Michael, to the ministry. He was a big fan of A Rude Awakening.
Yes.
Gave us some camera equipment, all kinds of things. And so these scrolls have become legendary in our office. And there's some big stories behind scrolls. I've heard of things like being smuggled out of places where Saddam Hussein was setting fire to every Torah scroll and all these type of things. So there's all kinds of stories out there. But there are some verified stories about scrolls, and we have one especially about this. Now this is yours, right, Keith? This is your scroll?
I guess you could say it's my scroll.
Okay.
But I don't consider it my scroll. I feel like it's been on loan from the Father. And that sounds really radical.
For sure. Yeah, no, I get that.
Because of it, this scroll, my life has changed. It's related to Michael. It's related to Nehemiah. It's related to myself. There's a story that interconnects us all. And I just have to say, it wasn't our plan to actually do this. We were at the end of Hebrew Gospel Pearls, the biblical Beatitudes, verse 12, talking about rejoicing. Yeshua tells us to rejoice. And Nehemiah was the one a little while ago, he said, you know, maybe the rejoicing is around the Torah scroll. And so this talk after talk after talk, it took until, I think it was yesterday or something, we said, you know what? Maybe we should bring this scroll in that is related to this in talking about rejoicing. And so that's why it's here. And hopefully we're going to tell that story.
Well, I want to explain the association that I had with rejoicing and the Torah scroll. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 12 in the Hebrew, it says, Sisu v'simchu, which is rejoice and be happy. And that word simchu, my association is there is a Jewish celebration every year. It happens the last day of Sukkot, and it is called Simchat Torah, the rejoicing over the Torah. And the being happy over the Torah, being glad over the Torah. And the idea of Simchat Torah is you just spent a year reading each week a Torah portion, and when you get to the end, you rejoice. And growing up, this was one of the biggest holidays for me. It's not a holiday commanded in the Torah, it's more of a traditional addendum in a sense to Sukkot, right? Because Sukkot's the one God commanded. Here, on the occasion of Sukkot and the renewing of the cycle of reading the Torah, what they'll do is they will, in the synagogues, they'll dance around the synagogue in a big circle. And what they do is they take the Torah scrolls out from the ark and they hand people the scrolls, and you have to be very careful because the tradition is if a scroll falls on the ground, you're supposed to fast for 40 days. Now, Scott, I could probably do with some fasting, but I'm not so sure about 40 days. And it was funny, I was sharing this with this woman who in England who had a Torah scroll in her church. And I told her about this. She said, well, I'm not Jewish. I said, I'm not saying you should fast. I'm trying to communicate to you how significant this is in Jewish culture, the Torah scroll. And you mentioned how, when books are printed, they're all identical. And in a sense, the Torah scroll is this archaic artifact, right? It has the 5 books of Moses written out by hand, but it's more than that. When the parchments are prepared, according to the tradition, they have to be prepared specifically for the intent of writing on them a Torah scroll. So you can't just go, let's say 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, you couldn't just go to the market where they might have parchments for all kinds of handwritten documents and say, okay, I'll take 3 of these and 2 of those. No, they had to be prepared specifically for the purpose of writing a Torah scroll. There are all kinds of other rules and regulations that go into writing a Torah scroll. And the idea was that originally everything was on scrolls. Didn't matter what you were writing, scrolls were the way things were written. Unless you wrote like on stone on the wall or on clay tablets, right? But if you were writing on a flexible material, it was a scroll written on leather. And what happened is there was this invention during the Roman period called the Codex. A codex is very similar to our modern book. It essentially is our modern book. The Codex is, and I remember this when I was a kid in elementary school, we would have these really old, beat up books that were maybe 10 or 20 years old, and the back was coming off, and you could see how there were these little notebooks, right? And they would sometimes come apart, and you'd see there were pages folded, and inside them other pages, inside them other pages. That's a codex. Right? We call it a book today, but it's essentially that's a codex. And when the codex came along, it was quickly adopted by Christians, and Jews said, no, our Bible has always been in the form of a scroll. We're going to continue perpetuating this format, not just the contents, but the actual format needs to be perpetuated based on how it was when it was received from Moses, when Joshua received it from Moses, and et cetera. Meaning, they have this idea that the Torah should be reproduced the exact way it always was. And Simchat Torah, you take out these Torah scrolls from the ark and you dance around with them, and that'll actually be important. So when I heard, when we got to the end of this thing, sisu v'simchu, I had two associations with those words. The first word, sisu, is another word for rejoice, and it's associated with a bride, a groom over a bride. And that made me think of the Torah scroll. Why did it make me think of the Torah scroll? We could show here to the audience. This is a wedding photo. This is at Keith's house outside. It was during COVID. And I was in one corner with my fiance, soon-to-be wife. Keith was in another corner with his wife. Yeah. The two witnesses were in the third corner. And so Keith had this amazing idea. He said, let's take out the Torah scroll as a witness to this wedding. Amen. And so I actually got married in front of a Torah scroll. And that's not even entirely accurate. Not a Torah scroll. I got married in front of this Torah scroll. Wow.
Already it has a story.
Yeah. So now why this Torah scroll? And I'll let Keith back up 20 years before that, 19 years before that, and say why this Torah scroll.
Permission to slow down.
Oh, do tell us some
because
detail
I have to
here.
tell you something. I've been overwhelmed with the idea of even bringing this scroll in here to this place. This place, for me, represents Michael Rood. It represents Nehemiah, and represents myself. And this scroll, and it even represents Reggie White, believe it or not. When I first saw a Torah scroll, I was the director of Christian Athletes United for Spiritual Empowerment. Well, I had two founders of our ministry. One of them was Reggie White. And we used to do a conference every year. And this particular conference we did in Colorado. And it was the first time I ever saw a Torah scroll. So I'm here with all these athletes. I'm the director. I'm in charge. I'm in the front row, and there's a Torah scroll. Scott, I reach my hand out towards the Torah scroll, and I start to weep. And I'm like, why am I crying? I have no idea. Tears are coming down. My sister-in-law is next to me. I'm like, you have any tissue? I couldn't explain. Why would I cry? So after that experience with the Torah scroll, a year later, I had a dream. And the dream was very clear. It was around the time of Passover, 2002. And I heard a voice that said, if you can tell me where the scroll opens up, you win $1 million. I said, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 3, a scroll comes down. I wake up. It was at that spot, 1-3. And I hear a voice that says, meet me in my city at the time of Shavuot. And I was like, what? No, it's like really a voice, okay? Now, folks are going to listen and saying, okay, you guys are making up all this stuff. Here's where this gets really, really concrete, Scott. I hear this voice, and then the question is, okay, I know I'm supposed to be in Israel at the time of Shavuot / Pentecost for my tradition. I'm finding out when that is. Okay, here's when it is. I start talking to my friends. Reggie White was one. I said, hey, Reggie, you know anybody in Israel? He said, yeah, I know a guy named Michael Rood. Here's the phone number. Give me the phone number. I call Michael Rood. I don't know who Michael Rood, never heard of him. Hi, my name's Keith Johnson. I had a dream. I'm supposed to be in Israel at the time of Shavuot. Can I come stay at your house? Silence on the phone.
He's waiting to see if it was bad pizza.
Yeah, it's like, wait, what's this? So long story short, I told this story at Shavuot last year. You can hear about it. Michael says, absolutely, you can come. He opens up the house. Now, before I leave to go to Israel, I say to myself, I got to get my own Torah scroll. So I start calling around. Come to find out, since I didn't win the $1 million, there's no way I was going to afford it. $50,000 for a brand new Torah scroll. Ooh. I didn't care. I brought an empty suitcase. I called it my ark. I'm going to bring the scroll back. I tell my wife I'm going to go to Israel. She says, why do you have the empty suitcase? I said, honey, I'm going to bring back a Torah scroll. She's like, okay. Good luck. I go to Israel let me give you the short story. I get to Israel. I'm every day out walking, experiencing things. I meet a man and I say to him, hey, I found a phone number of some people with a Torah scroll, however they speak Hebrew. That's not a language that I'm speaking. He spoke two languages, Arabic and Hebrew, and he spoke English. He calls on the phone. Long story short, finds out there's a man who has Torah scrolls in a place called Ma'ale Adumim. Ma'ale Adumim is a significant place. I don't want to take over here, but Nehemiah, would you do me a favor? Could you share just a little bit about the significance of that place, Ma'ale Adumim?
Well, Ma'ale Adumim is a geographical location mentioned in the Tanakh, and it is about 30 minutes west of Jerusalem today. It's really a suburb of Jerusalem. The people who live in Ma'ale Adumim drive to work in Jerusalem. And in recent history, the significance of Ma'ale Adumim is that it's one of two places in the areas that Israel liberated in 1967, in Judea and Samaria. It's one of two places where there's such a large population concentration that there's no way Israel could give that to the Arabs without expelling 50 to 100,000 Jews. And if you think just on a financial level, the country couldn't afford to do that, right? You'd have 100,000, maybe even 150,000 people who would be homeless. You'd destroy their homes. Now, they actually did that to 9,000 people in Gaza, which I think was a tragedy. It was a horrible thing. They were promised by the United States government they would get $10 billion to resettle those people. Almost immediately after they expelled the Jews from Gaza, Hurricane Katrina hit. And it was decided by the United States, well, we have better things to do than give this to Israel. We're going to use it for Hurricane Katrina relief. And so they kicked those Jews out, and some of them were living in tents years later. So in Israel, they say, we can't kick our people out of Ma'ale Adumim because where would we put them? We couldn't even afford to move them if we wanted to. It's just impractical. So if we're gonna make peace, there has to be some kind of compromise here. So that's really today the significance of Ma'ale Adumim.
So find out.
And my sister lives in a suburb of Ma'ale Adumim.
Oh, wow.
We find out that this guy who has these Torah scrolls is in Ma'ale Adumim. He happens to be out of the country in South Africa, out in Greece. He's got a South African man watching his house and his son. I've got an Arab man who says to me, I can help you get this Torah scroll. He says, but it's not good for me to go there. Long story short, I made him go. We went, we showed up, and in this apartment, this Jewish apartment, there are 3 scrolls. I look at the one and I think to myself, which one fits in my suitcase? I'm telling you, that's all I know. Which one's gonna fit in my suitcase? I get it. The Arab man says this to me, Scott. He says, it is a holy book. We must take it home immediately. Everything changes. We put it in the car. We go back to Michael's house.
So this is not a Jewish man. This is an Arab man.
This is an Arab man.
Okay.
Well, the Arab man is with him at the house of the Jewish man.
I'm trying to tell the short story because I see the time. See,
but I mean, he even has respect for the scroll, even though it's not his belief.
Well, and I'll tell you why. This gentleman, this Arab man was a Muslim, and in the Quran, it actually recognizes the Torah as a valid book.
Oh, okay.
It calls it Torah, the Torah.
Okay.
And it recognizes that is, according to them, the word of God.
Amen.
So Muslims consider the Torah to be sacred.
Yeah. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this will relate to Michael. At the time that I went was the time of the Second Intifada. Things are blowing up all over. The State Department says, don't go to Israel. When I get to Michael's house, he says, oh, okay, you can go where you want, but don't go to the West Bank. I'm like, okay, I won't go to the West Bank. The guy who's going to take me to the Torah scroll says to me, I'll take you to Ma'ale Adumim if first you'll go with me to Bethlehem, which was closed at that point. And nobody goes to Bethlehem at that time. It had just had the Church of the Nativity.
Where the terrorists had taken over the Church of the Nativity.
Yes.
And they were holding the monks hostage.
They were holding them hostage. And so here I am with this Arab man on my way to Bethlehem. And there's nobody there. There's no tourists there. But I'm there because the deal was I go with him first. He goes with me second.
Why did he drag you to Bethlehem?
He said he wanted me to see it. He says, I'll take you. But
when Keith tells the story to my mother about going to Bethlehem, she says that was a very dumb thing to do.
That was a very dumb thing. And I think Michael would have said at that point,
right.
Listen, there was not a smart thing to do. However, let me tell you something. When God gives vision, he always gives provision. The vision was I knew I'd come back with a Torah scroll, and I had found an Arab man who I thought was going to help me get to a place to get it. After I get the Torah scroll, I go back to Michael's house. It's me and it's Michael and someone else is staying there. And I said, hey, Michael, I'd asked him some questions about Hebrew and Greek. And what I loved about Michael, every time I saw him, he was studying his Bible. Every time. But here's what he never did. he never said to me something that he didn't know. So if I went to him and I said, Michael, what about the Greek? He says, that's not something I'm focusing on. Hey, I really want to go into the Hebrew. He says, I know a man, Nehemiah Gordon from the Hebrew University. I want you to meet him, he says. He's the guy that can help you. He calls Nehemiah. This is so significant. He calls Nehemiah, and we're going to meet at a place called Mount Zion Hotel. And we go to the Mount Zion Hotel. Now imagine the conversation is between Nehemiah and Michael. I can't get a word in edgewise. I finally get Nehemiah's attention. I say, hey, Nehemiah, listen, I got a Torah scroll. Stops eating. Okay. And I had a dream. He starts eating again. In other words, this is some crazy Christian guy who's going to come and talk about this stuff. I tell him about the Torah scroll, and Nehemiah's like, it's not a real Torah scroll. There's no way. Michael says, all right, here's how we can solve it. Let's go back to my house.
So let me explain my perspective. So I mentioned to you about Simchat Torah, the end of Sukkot. Everyone dances around in the synagogue, and they're dancing in a giant circle around the synagogue, carrying Torah scrolls. But if you drop the Torah scroll, you're supposed to fast for 40 days. So what do you do with all the kids who are celebrating? So you give them a little toy Torah scroll. It's printed on paper. These days, it's made in China. Back then, I think it was made in Taiwan. You give them a printed Torah scroll, which isn't considered to have the same sanctity as the handwritten Torah scroll written by a scribe who undergoes certain, all kinds of different rituals in order to write the scroll on parchment the way it was written, possibly or presumably in the time of Moses. The little printed one, it costs, 75, 100 shekel. The kid drops it, nobody really cares, right? Okay, you shouldn't drop the Torah, but it's not the same magnitude in Jewish culture.
Sure.
And I'm sure that's what this guy has. He's got a little toy printed Torah scroll. It's on white paper.
He's going to teach me a lesson. So this is my first time meeting Nehemiah. He's coming to Michael's house. Michael knows what's going on. I don't know what's going on. All I know is I need somebody to help me with this Torah scroll. First of all, we come into the house, and Nehemiah says, he looks at it, and his face changes. He looks at the front of the Torah scroll. He says, you know what that says on there? I was like, of course I don't. I have no idea. All I know is it will fit into my suitcase. Okay? He reads what's on the front of the Torah scroll. Nehemiah, would you read what's on the front of this Torah scroll? Maybe hold it up so that people can see it.
I'll do that, but I want to read the whole passage once we, I want to give it a context here.
Put it on the screen so everyone can see it.
Let's put it up here. It says, I can't actually see it over there. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, for out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, u'devar, and then it has a hey representing Yud He Vav He, and the word of Yehovah mi Yerushalayim, and the word of Yehovah from Yerushalayim. Mm-hmm. And what moved me about it, why I was all of a sudden silent, is here is this guy, I think he's some crazy Christian. I wasn't entirely wrong.
It's a pastor from the Methodist pastor who's come to Israel.
Pastor, something to do with football players. I don't know what this is about. And he gets a Torah scroll. That doesn't make sense. Torah scrolls cost tens of thousands of dollars. Mm-hmm. You can pay a lot more than 50 if depending on the situation. You can pay less too if it's maybe not as nice, or maybe if it's refurbished. So I'm thinking, well, there's no way this is a real Torah scroll. And I see this. Well, you don't see this on the toy scrolls, right? You'd see it, but it would be much smaller. This is not what I expected. And I immediately recognize this as a prophecy from Isaiah. Let me read it. It's Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. It's also in the book of Micah. It shall come to pass in the end of days, the mountain of Yehovah shall be established. The mountain of the house of Yehovah shall be established at the head of the mountains and be raised up from the hills. And all the nations shall flow to it. And the word there is they'll flow like a river. And many nations shall go and they will say, let us go up to the mountain of Yehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us from his ways, and we will go in his paths. For the Torah shall go forth out of Zion, what it says here, and the word of Yehovah from Jerusalem. And here was this Gentile coming to me, coming to Israel, coming to the place of the mountain of Yehovah. We're at the Mount Zion Hotel. Zion is the name of the mountain on which the temple is built. And here he is coming and saying he doesn't know why. He had some dream and he's supposed to come get the Torah. And I'm like, whoa, okay, wow, that's interesting.
Well, we'll continue with this in just a second, but that always brings to mind this little joke that I always say. That's one of those moments where God turns to Gabriel and says, hey, Watch this. Watch what I'm going to do. This is going to blow their minds.
Blow my mind.
Yeah, and it did. It blew our minds.
Okay, well, it gets better, so stay tuned. It gets better. You heard these guys talk about it. So if you are enjoying this program so far, we have you to thank for it because you are the one who makes this possible. You make it possible for us to bring in Nehemiah and to bring in Keith. And we just want to thank you, first of all, for making this show possible. And we're asking you, would you make it possible for others to see? This is where you come in now. If you can make a donation to A Rude Awakening right now, we can ensure that this teaching and teachings like it get to go to other folks who haven't seen anything like this before. Let's blow their minds with the word of Yehovah, with the things Yehovah puts together. Let them see that this kind of stuff is real. So we're going to leave you just for a couple of minutes here. We'll be right back, and thank you in advance for your donation.